Hey gang, welcome to Module 7. I think we're officially halfway done with the semester, which is pretty crazy. For some of you guys, it is your first semester ever in college, and I want to congratulate you for making it halfway. For others of you, kudos for surviving another 7 weeks, if you will. It's a crazy time with all this COVID stuff. It's a crazy time with the online learning. You guys, for the most part, are doing excellent in this class. Good work. Keep it up. This week, we're going to be focused on the obesity epidemic / pandemic, right? So obesity, most of us are going to be familiar with, but let's talk more specifically about how obesity is really kind of spread and permeated across the world and how bad it has gotten and why it has officially taken place, or realistically, what are the root causes of obesity and how can we expect to fix them as we move forward in our careers in the field of kinesiology. Before we can go really too far, we need to have a shared common definition between all of us as like a working definition, right? So what that's going to serve for us is going to be that obesity is a complex multifactorial chronic disease that's developing from both an interaction of genotype as well as our environment. Current understandings of obesity are relatively incomplete, and especially the hows and the whys of the formation or the development of obesity. What we do know is that it involves the integration of social, behavioral, cultural, psychological, physiological, metabolic, and genetic factors. Right? Like, obesity is all-encompassing. It's everything from attitude to genes. It's everything from what you put into your body to the supplements that you're taking. It is everything. Obesity is this overarching multifactorial disease that has root causes in everything, and that's going to make nailing down the specific mechanism a little bit difficult. But what it does do is it gives us a bunch of targets to be shooting at to try to help combat the obesity epidemic and pandemic that's really now enveloped the entire world. So over on the left-hand side, what I want you guys to pay attention to is just how bad obesity has gotten in the United States. I know that for many of you, you've seen these numbers, you've seen all this data before, but again, it's sometimes worth a sobering look at how rapidly obesity has developed in the United States. So on the bottom left, what you're going to see is a map of the United States in the year of 1990. So this was a survey put out by the CDC to look to see at what percentage rate of individuals in the U.S. were obese. And that's just obese, right? That's not overweight. We'll get into the difference between overweight and obesity, but this is, think very, very large individuals. So if you'll look, you can see that realistically, the highest range on there is going to be in that 10 to 14% obesity range. Now, if you flip forward to 2019, I want you to pay attention to the fact that we have basically had to start inventing colors and start making colors and adding colors because we as a country have gotten so fat. You can look and you can see that the Bible Belt, the Southeast region, has actually gotten to where it's over 35% obesity. Other parts of the country aren't nearly as bad, but in general, I mean, we're floating between 25 and 35% of the U.S. population is obese. That's scary. That's alarming. And why it's so alarming is that it is costing us billions and hundreds of billions of dollars every single year out of our domestic products, out of our national spending, if you will. And it's crazy, right? That this number, 117 billion, was from the year 2000. So if we think trajectory-wise, that we saw what 1990 looked like, and we saw what 2020 looked like. So think 2000, 117 billion dollars. That was 20 years ago. Think about how much it costs now. And what it's talking about when it's talking about direct and indirect costs is it's talking about lost wages, time off, that type of stuff for the indirect. And then the direct is actually the medical management and the medical bills side of obesity. Right? Like that's almost 10%, probably more, of healthcare spending overall. So that's 10%. Think every disease, every major disease, every cancer, everything. We are covering 10% of all of healthcare spending with obesity. It's crazy, right? Like, that is wild to think about. That's how much money it's costing us for something that can largely be preventable. So what does this look like? Why would it be so expensive in the indirect causes? Why is it that we're losing wages or we're having so much expense when it comes to obesity? Well, one, it's costing companies billions of dollars themselves. And the reason why it's costing companies billions of dollars is because of insurance. There's more than twice as many sick days taken for individuals that are obese or morbidly obese, or even heavy overweight individuals take more sick days in general. Their body's in a constant state of inflammation, so they actually get sicker more often. You have to pay attention to things like disability and whether or not individuals are actually able to work. It is possible that someone could be so large that they're actually unable to work. Self-esteem, emotional factors, start thinking about the mental health side of this. Start thinking about the fact that when you look in the mirror, you realize that there's something wrong and you are fighting with everything in you to try to maintain a positive outlook on life. Those are very tough things. Another thing that a lot of you might not have ever noticed, but I want you to pay attention to it now, is start paying attention to how retrofitted everything is now. Pay attention to the average size chair in the airport. Pay attention to the average size chair in the hospital waiting room or in any waiting room that you go into. Think about how much it would cost to retrofit all of these buildings in order to kind of increase size along with the increasing belt line of Americans. It's absolutely wild. It's just continually driving this bottom line up and up and up and up and up, and we're just spending more and more money on obesity every year. Not only is it costing us money, but it could be costing us our safety. There's actually been some recent discussions from some of the top generals in the United States, as well as some of the top researchers in the United States, that some of our troops might be too fat to fight, right? Let that sink in. It's actually been cited as the number one threat to the American national security is the fact that we have too many potential soldiers that are overweight or unfit for service. So we actually might end up having a low census in the military, a lowered ability to fill ranks if we needed to defend ourselves, because as a country, we are so overweight. That's sobering. That is scary. The number one threat to national security is ourselves, and it's our ever expanding belt line and ever expanding pant size. It's crazy. So if we start looking at overweight and obesity, and what's the difference between underweight, normal range, overweight, obese, right? There's this concept of BMI, or BMI is our body mass index. And how you calculate your body mass index is you calculate your height in meters, you square that number, and then you divide your body weight in kilograms by your height in meters squared, right? Kind of a goofy number. Essentially what it is doing is it is bringing everyone into a kind of general range of BMI, right? It's trying to put a common denominator onto everyone's body weight, and that would be meters squared. So we're adjusting for height and dividing the body weight by, or body mass by, height. So what you start to get at is if you have a BMI of less than 18.5, you technically fall into the underweight category range. If you are in the 18.5 to 24.9, you're of normal weight. As soon as you go over 24.9 BMI, you actually start getting into the overweights. And there is two different classes of overweight. You have overweight and you have obese. Essentially, obese is when you have a BMI of 30.0 or greater. After you have that BMI of 30.0 or greater, we end up having multiple classifications of obesity. If you have interest, you can actually go down and calculate your BMI on this level, on this link down here in the slides. It's important because BMI is is actually linked with comorbidities. And that means that the greater your BMI, the higher your BMI, the higher the likelihood you are of developing comorbid risk factors. And that means that it's the more likely you are to have disease, to have illness, or to die prematurely. With that increased comorbidity, it should come as no surprise that obesity is a major player in a ton of different diseases, right? So diabetes, extremely common to see type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance in individuals that are obese. Do you have to be overweight or obese to develop type 2 diabetes? Not even close. But what we've seen and what we've identified in the research is that the more an individual gains weight, the greater the gain of weight, the more likely it is that an individual is going to develop either type 2 or eventually type 1 diabetes. Coronary artery disease and peripheral artery disease, this is where we actually start occluding blood flow with fat accumulation inside of our arteries. And that means that we actually reduce the amount of blood flow to the organs that need it, and eventually it can kill us. Stroke, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, hyperlipidemia, which contributes to that coronary artery disease. You can have things like pregnancy complications, so obesity actually leads to higher risk pregnancies, depression, eating disorders, mental disorders. There's like breast cancer is one of the highest linkages with obesity in women. It is crazy, right? Obesity actually doubles your risk factor of breast cancer. Shocking. Like, that's how potent of a factor that obesity is. That's how deadly of a factor obesity actually is. What is it exactly that's causing us to get fat? If we know that obesity and overweight is not good, then what is it that's causing us to get there? Is it something that we can do to prevent it? Is there anything that we can do to prevent it? The answer in short is yes, but in long, it's pretty complicated, right? It's not just as simple as putting calories in your mouth or not putting calories in your mouth. And let's talk about that. So let's talk about this, right? Like, how about natural selection? Or let's talk evolution of mankind. Ever since mankind has really walked this earth, depending on, no matter how you view the origination of mankind, for the gross majority of human history, there has been a state of calorie deprivation that's been applied to us. Whether we're running around jungles, trying to get away from lions and tigers and bears, oh my, we're coming out of the Fertile Crescent, whatever it is that you believe, you can actually start looking at how humans have been incredibly efficient at identifying food sources, consuming food sources, and storing food sources. Now that we have gotten to this point of, even in the lowest income regions, we're almost in a point of nutrient opulence and food opulence, where we can actually go down to the store and buy food and have food readily available, or we can easily harness the calories that are within food. Never before has that been seen in human history. So our bodies haven't had a chance to evolve away from storing excess nutrients. We haven't had the ability to actually adapt to this. So it's possible that historically, individuals who were able to put on weight more were actually able to survive longer periods of famine. So it's likely that if you believe in natural selection, if you agree with natural selection, the individuals that were able to put on weight the easiest were actually the more successful competitors in the arena. So those ancestors of ours would be at a higher propensity of gaining weight. Essentially, at the very root of obesity, the overarching theme is that it is an energy imbalance, right? So we have our nutrient intake is exceeding our nutrient output, or our consumption is exceeding our expenditure. And that's how we boil it down to the purest sense. It is an energy imbalance. However, that whole picture is not clear. What is it that is causing that energy imbalance? Is it explicitly the calories in versus calories out? Well, that's a big chunk of it, but that's not the only bit of it. there's this concept of epigenetics. And essentially what epigenetics is it's the way that the environment interacts with our DNA. And while we all know that DNA and genetics are heritable traits, meaning that your mother and your father passed on heritable traits to you through your DNA, what we now know is that epigenetics is also a heritable trait. So the way that your parents interacted with the environment and the way that their DNA interacted with the environment is passed on to you. And that's important because it conveys an increased risk of these things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer risk, all of that. There's also a large mental health aspect of obesity that has to come into play, because there's behavior traits that occur. There's environmental factors that come into play when it comes to food. There's different types of food stuffs that we have to consider or might be actually causing obesity at higher rates than other food stuffs. It's a very nebulous picture. Realistically, the overarching concept or the foundational root of all of this is that there is an energy imbalance. So I want you guys to think about this like that old-fashioned classic scale, right? Like what you can see up on the top of the screen. I want you to think that on the left-hand side you have calories consumed, and on the right-hand side you have calories used. So if we tilt towards calories consumed, then we're going to not favor the calories used, and we're going to have a net weight gain. If we flip that and we have more calories being used than calories being consumed, we're going to favor net weight loss. Usually, weight gain is a combination of a lot of these factors, and that can be consuming food in excess or not exercising or moving our body enough. So when it comes to not moving our body enough or the effect of various food sources, we need to start looking at what are the components of daily energy expenditure for humans. And what I want you to see on this graph here is on the left-hand side, we have our percent of TDEE. And what TDEE stands for is total daily energy expenditure. And it's impossible to go over 100%, so that's why that y-axis is going to be scaled to 100%. You can see that the overwhelming majority, up to 70% of our total daily energy expenditure, is accounted for by our basal metabolic rate. And what our basal metabolic rate is, it's the amount of calories that our body would need to burn in order to stay alive just laying in bed all day, right? Not doing anything. You would literally just stay in bed all day and not do anything. That's your basal metabolic rate, the number of calories needed to maintain weight at that level. Then you're going to have a little bit of energy that's going to be coming from NEAT, N-E-A-T, or that's non-exercise activity-based thermogenesis. And what NEAT is essentially, it's the amount of calories utilized or the amount of energy utilized in any non-exercise activity. Duh, Parker, that's exactly what it says. However, I want you to think about this. This is walking up the stairs. This is standing up. This is moving to go grab your phone. It's typing on your phone. It's going to the bathroom. It's walking from class to class, right? Anything that is not dedicated exercise activity is going to be is going to be included under this NEAT category. The next level is going to be our thermic effect of food. Now, every single calorie that you eat is not going to be equivalent. Different types of foodstuffs have different thermic effect equivalencies. And what I mean by that is a carbohydrate is not going to produce the same amount of heat as a protein. A fat is not going to produce the same amount of heat as a carbohydrate or a protein. Each one of these foodstuffs is going to produce a different amount of energy expenditure in order to digest it and utilize it as fuel. So just because you're consuming 100 grams of protein, that is 4 calories per gram, 100 grams of protein would be about 400 calories. You can consume 400 calories of carbohydrates in that same 100 grams, 4 calories per gram, and they're not equivalent. They're not equivalency units. They're not going to produce the same amount of heat. The same thing with fat. While it's more calorie dense, it's got more calories per gram, you can consume the same 400 calories and produce a different amount of heat. So you can actually overconsume certain types of foods and not see a net weight gain, or you can underconsume certain types of foods and see an exceeding weight loss. We're also going to have our EAT, or our EAT, which is our exercise activity thermogenesis. That's the amount of calories that are going to be expended whenever you're doing direct and dedicated exercise activities, lifting weights, going for jogs, going for bike rides, all of that. Anything that's dedicated exercise is going to count in this EAT category. You're going to have your REE, which is your resting energy expenditure. That's this very similar concept to your basal metabolic rate. And then anything that's not basal metabolic rate is going to count as your non-resting energy expenditure. So realistically, how we can break this equation down is we can have a delta weight, or a change in weight, is equal to our energy intake minus our energy expenditure. Same thing as I've been saying, just written a little bit differently and written so that you can understand it as a math equation. Our energy intake is our calories consumed, right? Energy intake is our calories consumed. However, our energy expenditure is going to be comprised of our basal metabolic rate, our working, right? So our thermic effect of exercise, our thermic effect of food, all of that type of stuff is going to play into our energy expenditure. So you can actually break this down and look to see what is a change in weight really going to look like, and how, if you manipulate one variable, you can actually see various changes in weights. So if you change the specific macronutrient makeup of your food, you can actually change the weight that you're going to gain or lose. So if it seems to be that energy intake is at the root cause of obesity, why can't we just eliminate food, right? It sounds like a dumb question because we all know that we need food, but why is it that we need food? What is it that humans need food for? Why do we need sustenance? Why is it sustenance and not just a pleasure-based thing? Well, first, we need energy. Why do we need energy? Because we need to perform muscular contractions. We got to get away from the lion if the lion runs into the room, but we need it to maintain our body temperature. If our body temperature gets out of whack, our enzymes in our body stops working, our body stops working as it's designed, and we actually die. We need it for metabolism. We need foodstuffs to actually make energy and actually like fuel our skeletal muscle contractions and our body's work throughout the day. And we also need that food for energy for mechanical work. So if we need to get away from a lion or throw hands with a lion, or we need to lift weights, or even just keystrokes on the keyboard, is all requiring physical work, and it's requiring nutritional sustenance. Our bodies need food in order to grow, right? We need food to develop from infants into adolescence into grown adults. Food is a requisite for growth and development of humans, and we need it for maintenance and repair. We need it to actually help fuel reparations, or we need it to actually help fuel repair in the human body. Food is going to serve as a building block for us, and proteins especially are going to help repair torn muscle and repair injuries that we might develop while we're exercising or while we're being physically active in the world. Realistically, what I want you guys to think about here is, how does this slide, why we need food, apply to today, right? If we look, and MA means million years ago, if you look at Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens, right? 3 million years ago, 1.8 million years ago, 800,000 years ago is when these three forms of human-like creatures were walking the earth. And essentially, in those times, food was needed to live. And food was needed to be found and secured and consumed simply to live. And in order to not thrive, but just to survive, food was needed. Nowadays, in modern era, we don't really need food at the same level at which it is available to us. Back in these days, food was scarcely available, and we had to consume it at rates that were high, but we could not do so because it was scarce. Nowadays, there's a lack of food scarcity, and we actually need to consume less food in order to make sure that we're not getting overweight or obese. Outside of the kind of like traditional view of food, what is food for? Why do we have food around? Why do we have nutrition around? And how might these issues be leading to some of the obesity, like some of the obesity epidemic and pandemic that we're seeing? Well, we have food that's associated for work and of course for fueling mechanical work in the body and for fueling heat. But what about comfort? How many times have you ever just been like completely bummed out and go to food for comfort? For me, it's like pizza, right? Like if I had a stressful day, then I'm slamming back some pizza and some beer, right? Like it is a comfort. It is a human-based comfort that we have developed because food releases certain hormones in our body and in our brain to be pleasurable, right? Food's used for celebrations. Look at things like birthday cakes. We have such strong emotional ties to the celebration uses of food, the religious uses of food, as well as think about it. What do you do for fun when you go out with friends? You go eat, right? Like you go to dinner. We go to restaurants for recreation and for fun. That entire concept around food not just being nutrition and sustenance is one of the primary driving factors behind the obesity pandemic. It's actually this concept of overconsumption of food is being like really propelled by these social factors and these, not just these biological factors, but these social factors at the same time. So how do we measure it, right? We've talked about some of the root causes. We talked about what are some of the issues with it. How do we measure body fatness? Well, one, you can go on appearance. Is that always accurate? No, of course it's not. But can it be accurate? Oh, it definitely can, right? You can look at someone and tell if they are obese. You can, plain and simple, as terrible as it is, you can. You can use something called a waist to hip ratio. And what the waist to hip ratio is representing is the risk of disease or risk of development of hypertension and coronary artery disease. And essentially, the waist measure is taken, as you can see over here, is taken at the umbilicus, and then the hip measurement is taken at the widest part of the glutes. And if that waist to hip ratio is 0.8 or lower in females or 0.95 or lower in males, then that's a low health risk. If you're in the 0.81 to 0.85 or 0.96 to 1.0 range from females and males respectively, that's going to be a moderate risk. And then once you go over 0.85 for females or 1.0 or higher for males, it indicates a high risk situation. And that means that individuals are at a greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, coronary artery disease, obesity. All those things start to come into play with the waist to hip ratio, and it is a quantitative measure. Skin folds are another way of measuring, and that's what you see down here. Essentially, we have specific sites on the body, like our triceps, our mid-ax, our abdomen, which is what the site that you're seeing. We have our pectoralis or our chest fold. There's several different folds that we can actually take. We add those numbers together and we can estimate body density. And then off of that body density estimate, we can actually estimate body fat percentage. And then we can use that body fat percentage to tell if an individual is overweight or obese. Now, something to think about here is that BMI does not give us this direct measure of body fatness. It is very possible that BMI is not correlated completely or 100% correlated or does not 100% track with body fatness. It definitely doesn't. On an individual basis, BMI is not the most accurate of things for predicting disease risk. However, if we go to a population level, which is what BMI was actually designed for, then BMI is a very useful tool. And to be completely honest with you, more often than not, even on an individual level, BMI can be extremely useful. It's just we as a population and we as a culture have become overly sensitive to the concept of an increased body fatness on ourselves. You can also use a DEXA measure, which is dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. Essentially, it's a fancy type of X-ray in order to determine body fatness or the percent body fat of an individual. So if we know loosely what are some of the causes of obesity and overweight, how is it that we actually combat these? How is it that we actually go for weight loss and try to actually coach ourselves or another individual to lose weight and become slightly more healthy? Well, step one is going to be establishing a calorie deficit. And the way you establish that calorie deficit is two-part. One, you restrict calories being consumed, right? Two, you increase the level of exercise or physical activity of the individual. Remember, energy balance comes from our energy consumed versus our energy expended. We can actually expend energy through exercise and physical activity, and we can minimize the amount of energy consumed. That will put us in a greater energy deficit. When that energy deficit gets low enough, we actually begin losing weight. After you establish that calorie deficit of physical activity or calories consumed, you start fine-tuning the macronutrient contributions to that energy consumption. And that means that you start manipulating the number of carbohydrates that an individual is consuming. You start manipulating the percent of protein as well as the percent fat that's coming from their diet. When it comes to weight loss, you want to make sure that you're keeping protein high. Protein is protein sparing. And what that means is that if you maintain your protein higher when you're losing weight, you feel fuller and you help conserve your muscle mass, right? Two incredibly important things that come with weight loss is making sure that you feel full so that you're not likely to cheat, and two, we're preserving our muscle mass. Because if we lose muscle mass at the expense of weight loss, it can actually lead to negative consequences. Third, we want to manipulate our training. We can actually fine-tune our training periodization and our training programming in order to facilitate greater amounts of weight loss. This could be manipulating the intensity of exercise, those target heart rate zones that we've talked about. We can manipulate all of those things in order to facilitate greater weight loss. And then lastly, if individuals are interested in supplementing or adding in sports nutrition supplements, this is where you can start tossing some of those things in. After you've already locked in a calorie deficit, you've got their macros locked in, their training is perfect, and then they can start supplementing. Realistically, the base of all of this is going to be that calorie deficit. And then those supplements can be used to help them feel a little bit better, maybe give them that 5% nudge to get them closer to where they're trying to get. Everything else is making up 95% of the problem, or 95% of the solution. If you have more interest in this, reach out to me. I'd love to talk further with you guys about the obesity pandemic. It is here to stay, and it is continuing to grow. And I think that we can only do ourselves a better favor by getting to know this stuff more. And as you're going through your degree here at University of North Georgia, you're going to have to become extremely familiar with this stuff because it is huge, huge, huge in where our field is going.